The morning of my wedding, I sat in the bridal suite of the Harrington estate and watched my maid of honor pin the last button on my gown. 340 seed pearls, hand-stitched along the bodice. A silhouette my designer, Celeste Aurora, had spent 4 months perfecting. A dress that had made Celeste cry the first time I tried it on, which she told me had never happened in 22 years of designing bridal wear. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever owned. And I knew, standing there in the mirror while the morning light came through the tall windows and hit the fabric just right, that in approximately 4 hours, my sister Vivienne was going to walk through those reception doors wearing something designed specifically to make everyone forget I existed. What Vivienne didn't know was that security already had her photograph. My name is Nadia. I'm 31 years old. And the story I'm about to tell you begins not with a wedding, but with a family that spent the better part of 2 decades treating me like a footnote in my own life. If you're new here, welcome. Please subscribe and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one of them, and today, you're going to want to stay until the end. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand what happened at my wedding, I need to take you back to a Tuesday afternoon in October, when I was 11 years old, and my mother stood in our kitchen holding a painting I had made for a school art competition. I had won first place. The teacher had called our home to congratulate the family. My mother had framed the certificate and hung it on the wall near the staircase. And then Vivienne, who was 14 at the time, walked past it, said it looked cheap, and asked why the frame didn't match the hallway. By Friday, the certificate was gone. Vivienne's school volleyball trophy had taken its place. I know. That sounds small. Most people's origin stories don't begin with a certificate. But what I've learned is that the big things never arrive without a long line of small things walking ahead of them. That certificate was the first time I understood the rule of my family, and the rule was simple. There was room for one daughter to be exceptional. That daughter was Vivienne. My mother, Carol, was a woman who organized her entire emotional world around what other people thought of her. Not in an obviously vain way. She wasn't cruel on purpose. She was the kind of woman who needed the outside world to confirm that her life had turned out well. And for reasons I spent years trying to understand and eventually stopped trying, Vivienne was the version of her life she chose to show the world. Vivienne was tall, blonde, effortlessly social, the kind of girl who walked into a room and made people feel they'd been waiting for her. I was none of those things. I was quieter. I liked books and spreadsheets and solving problems that didn't involve other people's feelings. My father, William, was a kind man and a thoroughly useless one. He watched everything my mother did and called it keeping the peace. He told me once, when I was 16 and crying in the garage after a particularly bad dinner, that I just needed to understand how your mother works. I looked at him for a long moment and asked who was supposed to be understanding how I worked. He didn't have an answer for that. Vivienne and I were not close, though we were never openly at war. The dynamic was subtler than that. Vivienne didn't need to be cruel to me. She just needed to keep being Vivienne, and the contrast did the rest. When I got into the honors program at our high school, my mother said, "That's wonderful," and then spent 20 minutes on the phone telling her sister about Vivienne's new modeling contract with a regional agency. When I received a partial scholarship to study business at Alderton University, a school that had rejected Vivienne 2 years prior, my father took us both to dinner and spent the evening asking Vivienne about her marketing internship. I ate my food quietly and paid for my own glass of wine. The financial history of our family is something I didn't understand in full until I was 24 and sitting across from a tax attorney helping me file independently for the first time. My parents had a college fund for each of us. Mine was $38,000, accumulated over years of careful saving. Vivienne's was $52,000, but she had also received additional support throughout her 20s, a car at 21, a down payment contribution on her first apartment at 24, a lump sum of $18,000 described on a bank transfer as personal loan, no repayment terms ever mentioned again. When I asked my mother once, casually, why Vivienne had received so much more financial support, she looked at me with genuine confusion, as if I had asked something not merely impolite but incomprehensible. "Vivienne has different needs," she said. "You've always been the self-sufficient one." That sentence has lived inside me for years. You've always been the self-sufficient one. As if self-sufficiency was something that had simply grown in me like a trait, and had nothing to do with the fact that no one had ever offered to help. I built my career in supply chain consulting, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds and exactly as necessary. I joined a mid-sized firm called Strecker and Vane straight out of graduate school, worked brutal hours for 3 years, and made myself indispensable on a client account that brought in $2.3 million annually. By the time I was 28, I was a senior associate earning $94,000 a year. By 29, I had enough in savings to put a down payment on a 2-bedroom apartment. I did all of this without asking my parents for a single dollar after my scholarship ran out, because I knew, with the quiet certainty of a person who has been watching the rules of a system for long enough, that the money would not have been there for me anyway. Vivienne, during this same period, was living beautifully. She had pivoted from regional modeling to lifestyle content creation, which in practice meant that she had a well-decorated apartment, a carefully curated social presence, and an income that fluctuated between impressive and entirely fictional depending on the month. She had my mother's financial support as a cushion and my mother's emotional promotion as a megaphone. Every family dinner featured updates on Vivienne's brand partnerships, Vivienne's follower counts, Vivienne's upcoming collaboration with a home goods company. I would sit and listen and wonder what it would feel like to have someone talk about your life like it was worth paying attention to. I met Marcus at a work conference in the spring of my 28th year. He was a logistics director for a healthcare company, smart, dry-humored, the kind of man who paid attention when you were speaking. We dated for 2 years before he proposed, and when he did it quietly, just the two of us on the balcony of a rented house in Portugal, with a ring his grandmother had left him and a speech that lasted 45 seconds and said everything. I said yes before he finished the second sentence. Telling my family should have been simple. It was not. My mother's first response, before congratulations, before anything resembling warmth, was to ask whether Vivienne knew yet. I told her I had called Vivienne an hour before calling her. There was a pause, and then my mother said, "Good," because she would have felt left out. I held the phone against my ear and looked at Marcus across the room and thought, I have just told my mother I am going to be married, and she is worried about my sister's feelings. Vivienne's response to the engagement was a masterclass in the kind of behavior that is nearly impossible to explain to people who haven't experienced it firsthand. She was not overtly hostile. She was congratulatory in exactly the way a person is congratulatory when they are performing congratulation for an audience. She posted a photo of us on her social media with a caption that called me her best friend and her forever girl, which would have been lovely except that we had not had a real conversation in 3 months, and the last time she had called me it was to ask if I could connect her with someone at my firm who might want to sponsor her content. She started referring to the wedding in conversation as our big event, as if it were something happening to both of us rather than specifically to me. She offered opinions on the venue before I had chosen one, opinions on the catering, opinions on my color palette. She asked to be the maid of honor in a text message that was so casually phrased it read less like a question and more like a correction to an assumption. I had already asked my best friend from university, a woman named Priya, to be my maid of honor. When I told Vivienne this, the silence on the phone lasted long enough that I counted to 7. Then she said, "Oh, right, of course, I just assumed." The next day, she called my mother. By that evening, my mother had called me twice to explain that Vivienne was hurt and that I should think about how this looked. I chose the Harrington estate as our venue 8 months before the wedding. It was a converted 19th century property on the outskirts of the city, a main house, formal gardens, a chapel with original stone floors, capacity for 160 guests. The rental was $12,000 for the day, which Marcus and I split between us after careful planning and 6 months of additional savings. I chose Celeste Aurora for my dress after seeing her work at a colleague's wedding and crying in the car on the way home because the gown was so precisely what I had always imagined without knowing I had imagined it. Celeste's starting price for a custom bridal commission was $8,500. I paid it in 2 installments, the second one with money I had been setting aside since Marcus proposed. Vivienne came to my first fitting. I had not invited her. My mother had mentioned the appointment date in conversation, and Vivienne had simply shown up. She sat in Celeste's studio in a white linen jumpsuit and watched me step onto the fitting platform and said, after a very long look, "It's very you." Which in Vivienne's language meant nothing good. I saw Celeste's expression change slightly, the way someone's does when they are professionally required to remain neutral while privately finding someone irritating. I stepped off the platform and changed back into my clothes and did not invite Vivienne to the second fitting. The second fitting was in January, 6 months before the wedding. By that point, the dress was close to finished. The seed pearl work was 3/4 complete. Celeste had made adjustments to the neckline and the length of the train, and the result was something I had never felt in a garment before, a kind of recognition, like the dress had known what it was before I did. I cried. Celeste cried. Priya, who I had brought with me this time, took photographs on her phone and said absolutely nothing for 2 full minutes, which from Priya is the highest possible form of praise. 3 weeks after that fitting, I received a phone call from a woman named Dasha, who was Celeste's studio assistant. Dasha was calling, she told me, because she felt I should know something. She had debated calling. She wanted to be clear that Celeste did not know she was calling. But she felt it was the right thing to do. She told me that Vivienne had come into the studio the previous week while Celeste was at a trade showing and Dasha was alone. Vivienne had introduced herself as my sister and said she wanted to commission a gown for the wedding. She had been specific. She wanted something floor-length, ivory, formal, structured at the bodice, with embellishment. She had asked Dasha several questions about my dress. Specific questions. About the silhouette. About the neckline. About the embellishment technique. Dasha had told her nothing. Had explained that she could not discuss other clients' commissions. Vivienne had smiled warmly and thanked her and left. 3 days later, Dasha found out through a mutual contact in the bridal industry that Vivienne had commissioned a gown from a designer named Remy Voss, who was known for 2 things. The first was extraordinarily fast turnaround. The second was his specialty in what he publicly called interpretive elevation, which was his way of describing gowns that referenced another designer's work and made it louder, more attention-commanding, more aggressively visible. I sat with that information for a long time after I hung up with Dasha. I didn't call Marcus immediately. I didn't call Priya. I sat in my apartment kitchen with a cup of tea that went cold and I thought about the certificate that had been replaced by a volleyball trophy. I thought about the scholarship dinner. I thought about every moment I had been quieted, reduced, made smaller to create more room for someone else's shine. And then I thought, with a clarity that felt almost like relief, that I was done being surprised. I did not confront Vivienne. I did not call my mother. I did not post anything, say anything, or alter a single visible element of my wedding plans. What I did instead was make 3 calls. The first was to the head of security at the Harrington estate, a man named Gerald Osei, who had coordinated private events there for 11 years. The second was to Priya. The third was to Celeste, to apologize for what her studio assistant had experienced and to tell her that I was not going to let it change anything about the day. In the call with Gerald, I explained the situation without drama. I told him my sister was likely to arrive at the reception in a white gown. I told him this was not appropriate attire for a wedding guest and that if she appeared in one, I needed it handled quietly, professionally, and before she reached the reception room. I emailed him a photograph of Vivienne, one from her social media, recent, clear. He told me he understood completely. He told me this was not the first time he had handled a situation of this kind. Then he said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "You'd be amazed how often people think the bride won't find out until it's too late." I had found out. I had found out 3 months early. And I had spent every one of those months quietly making sure that when the day came, everything that needed to be in place was already there. The morning of the wedding, Priya pinned the last button on my dress and stepped back and looked at me. Her eyes went bright. She blinked it away. "Good," she said. "You look like someone who already won." I turned back to the mirror. 340 seed pearls. 4 months of Celeste's work. A train that moved like water when I walked. Outside the window of the bridal suite, the Harringtons' formal gardens were laid out in the May morning light, the hedgerows trimmed, the white chairs arranged in perfect rows along the chapel path, 160 guests arriving in their cars below. Somewhere across the city, my sister was getting dressed. I already knew what she was wearing. I smoothed the front of my gown with both hands and took a breath. Let her come, I thought. I'm ready. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon in the Harrington Chapel, which seated 84 people in original oak pews and had windows of plain leaded glass that turned the May light into something warm and diffuse. Marcus was already at the altar when Priya and I appeared at the entrance. He saw me from 30 feet away and his face did something I will keep to myself because some moments belong only to the people inside them. What I can tell you is that he did not look at anything else in that room for a long time. And I walked toward him feeling, for the first time in my adult life, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Vivienne was not in the chapel when the ceremony began. My mother was in the 3rd row on the left, wearing a dusty rose mother of the bride suit she had purchased with my input after 3 shopping trips and a video call. My father sat beside her, upright, quiet, his hands folded in his lap. I saw his face when I came through the door and something in it shifted in a way I had not seen before, something unguarded and genuine. He pressed his lips together and looked at the pew in front of him and blinked twice quickly. My father was not a man who cried. But he came close that afternoon, and I noticed it, and I filed it away in the place where I keep the things about him that make it impossible to be entirely finished with him. Vivienne arrived 9 minutes into the ceremony. I know the exact time because Priya had stationed herself near the entrance and texted me afterward with a 1-sentence summary that read, "She slid into the back pew in a black wrap dress looking inconvenienced." I could not see her from where I stood. I did not look. I had made a decision weeks before that my eyes would not go searching for Vivienne at my own wedding, that she would not be the thing my attention found when it wandered. Marcus held my hands and we said our words to each other and the officiant read a passage Marcus had chosen about the particular kind of courage required to truly know another person. I thought about that passage for a long time afterward. I still think about it. We were pronounced married at 2:47. The chapel applauded. Marcus kissed me with the reverence of someone who had been waiting a long time and didn't want to rush now that he was finally there. We walked back up the aisle together and I passed my father's pew and he reached out and touched my arm, just briefly, 2 fingers on my forearm as I passed, and said nothing. I did not stop walking. But I felt it. The reception was in the main house, in the Harringtons' great room, which ran the full length of the east wing and opened through tall French doors onto the formal garden. 120 guests, round tables, white peonies and low arrangements, a string quartet for the cocktail hour and a band for the dancing. Marcus and I had spent more time on the food than on anything else because we are both people who believe that feeding someone well is one of the most direct expressions of caring for them. The catering was from a restaurant called Outshine, 3-course dinner, locally sourced, $148 per head. We had not cut corners. We had not asked anyone to help pay for it. We had budgeted and saved and made every decision together, and walking into that room with Marcus's hand in mine, seeing it laid out exactly as we had imagined it, I felt the particular satisfaction of something earned. Gerald Osei found me during the cocktail hour. He was a broad, composed man in a dark suit who moved through a room the way experienced security personnel do, visible enough to be reassuring, quiet enough not to interrupt anything. He appeared at my shoulder while I was speaking with Marcus's mother, excused himself briefly, and said in a voice just above a murmur, "She arrived in the east car park 20 minutes ago. Black wrap dress. Changed in the estate's public restroom near the garden entrance. She is currently in the lower hall. I thanked him and turned back to Marcus's mother and finished my sentence about the peonies. The lower hall was the corridor connecting the garden entrance to the great room, a long, stone-flagged passage with framed botanical prints along one wall and a set of oak double doors at the far end that opened directly into the reception. It was where guests arriving late would naturally pass through. It was also, I knew from my venue walkthrough 7 months earlier, clearly visible from the reception room's entrance when those oak doors were open, as they would be throughout the evening for the garden access. Anyone standing near the entrance of the great room would have a direct sight line down that corridor. I had not chosen the Harrington by accident. I had not left the geography of the confrontation to chance. I excused myself from the cocktail hour and found Priya near the string quartet. I told her. She put her champagne glass down on the nearest surface with the careful deliberateness of a person suppressing a very large emotion and said, "She actually did it." I said, "She actually did it." Priya straightened up and looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Okay. Go be the bride. I have eyes on the hall." I went back to my husband. Vivienne made her entrance at 6:17, during the pre-dinner gathering when the greatest number of guests were standing, moving between tables, finding their seats, and the room was at its most social and its most visually open. The timing was not accidental. Vivienne had spent her entire adult life studying how attention moved in a room and where you needed to position yourself to catch it. I was standing with Marcus and 2 of his colleagues near the garden doors when my phone screen lit up in my clutch bag. A text from Gerald. One word, now. I did not move toward the hall. I did not change my expression. I kept my body angled toward Marcus's colleague, who was telling a story about a delayed flight, and I listened to it with the same attention I had been giving it 30 seconds before. Marcus felt my hand tighten briefly in his and glanced at me. I gave him the smallest nod. He had known this was coming. He was the only other person who had known everything. What happened in the lower hall was described to me afterward by 3 separate guests who had been near the entrance when Vivienne came through the garden door. She had come through an ivory. Not white, she would say later, as if the distinction were meaningful. Ivory. Floor length. The bodice structured and embellished with beading that caught the light. The silhouette close enough to mine that 2 guests who saw her in the corridor before being redirected said they thought for a moment that I had come back through the garden entrance. The gown was designed to be mistaken for a bridal dress. That was the entire point. Remy Voss had done exactly what he was known for doing. She had walked perhaps 12 feet into the lower hall when Gerald appeared from the side corridor with one of his staff members. He positioned himself politely but unmistakably in her path. He introduced himself as the head of security for the estate. He told her, calmly and without theater, that the bride had requested that guests in white or ivory formal gowns not be admitted to the reception, and that this policy had been communicated to the venue team in advance. He told her that the estate had a private changing room available if she wished to change into alternate attire, or that he would be happy to arrange for her personal items to be retrieved from the car park if she preferred to return at another time. Vivienne's first response, according to the guests nearby, was a laugh. The social laugh of a person who assumes the misunderstanding will resolve itself in their favor. She said something like, "I'm the bride's sister, I don't think she means me." Gerald told her, gently, that the policy had no exceptions and that he had been given specific guidance. She asked to speak to the bride directly. Gerald said he would check on that. He texted me. The text said, "She is asking for you." I handed my clutch bag to Marcus and touched his arm once. He squeezed my hand and let go. I walked through the great room toward the oak double doors with the quiet deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for this moment for 3 months and has had plenty of time to decide exactly how she wants to arrive in it. The doors were open. I could see down the length of the lower hall from the threshold. Guests near the entrance had noticed the pause and movement. Several had turned. The string quartet was between pieces. The room was briefly, naturally quiet in the way rooms sometimes go between songs, and into that quiet I walked through the doors and stopped at the top of the hall. Vivienne saw me immediately. And for one unguarded second, before the performance came back online, I saw her face clearly. Not the warm social surface she had been presenting to Gerald. The real thing underneath. Something that was not quite guilt and not quite fear but lived somewhere between them. She recovered fast. She was very good at recovering fast. Nadia. She said my name with a brightness that was practiced down to the syllable. Thank goodness. There's been a misunderstanding. Tell them I'm your sister. I looked at her for a long moment. The gown she was wearing caught the hall light along its beaded bodice. It was a beautiful dress. It had been commissioned to be a beautiful dress. It had been commissioned to be, specifically, a more beautiful dress than mine, worn by a more arresting woman than the bride, in a room full of people whose attention Vivienne had decided should belong to her even on the one day in my adult life that was entirely mine. I looked at the dress. I looked at my sister. And I said, I know exactly who you are, Vivienne. The hall was very quiet. She blinked. Her smile held but her eyes changed. You're being ridiculous, she said, her voice dropping slightly, the brightness thinning at the edges. It's just a dress. You're making a scene over a dress. I wasn't raising my voice. I want to be clear about that. My voice was entirely level. I had been waiting for this conversation for 3 months, and in that time I had thought through every version of it, and what I had learned was that composure, in the face of someone who expected either compliance or explosion, was the most disorienting thing I could offer her. Gerald booked this estate in January, I said. I gave him your photograph in February. He's had your name on the policy list for 11 weeks. She stared at me. Behind me, I was aware of the room. I did not turn around, but I felt it, the way you feel weather changing. The guests near the oak doors had gone still. The conversation nearest to me had stopped. Whatever the string quartet had been about to play, they had not started it. Vivienne's voice shifted into something harder. You planned this. You set me up. I gave you the exact same information I gave every other guest, I said. The dress code was on the invitation. No white, no ivory, no champagne. You chose to commission an ivory gown anyway. You chose to change into it in the estate bathroom. You made every one of those choices on your own. Her face had changed entirely now. The warmth was gone. The performance had run its course. What was left was something I had seen only a few times in my life, the expression of a person who has been caught so completely and so publicly that they cannot find the angle to talk their way around it. She looked past me into the great room, where I now knew, though I did not turn to confirm it, that a significant number of guests were watching. I had chosen to have this conversation at the threshold of those open doors for the same reason I had given Gerald the policy in writing and her photograph 11 weeks in advance. Because Vivienne had spent my entire life doing things to me in private and letting them land in public. And I wanted, just once, for the truth to land in exactly the same room where the performance had been staged. I want you to think about what you're doing, she said. Mom is in there. Dad is in there. You want to do this in front of them? In front of everyone? You chose the dress, Vivienne. You chose to wear it here. I'm just the person who was ready for it. She looked at me for a long moment. And then, because Vivienne had always been brilliant at reading the room, she looked past me at the crowd that had gathered at the threshold, and she understood what she was seeing. She was not looking at people who were on her side. She was looking at people who were witnessing something they would be talking about for years. She was looking at the story of the day forming in real time, and she was not the one who got to write it. She turned to Gerald. She asked him, very quietly, about the changing room. He gestured down the side corridor. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She walked down that corridor without looking at me again. The dress moved as she went, the beading catching the light one last time. Then she turned the corner and was gone. I stood at the threshold of the lower hall for a moment in the quiet. Then I turned around. The oak doors were open and the great room was in full view, 100 guests, Marcus near the garden doors, Priya with her hand pressed flat against her sternum, my mother standing very still beside a table with both hands wrapped around a champagne glass she was not drinking from. My father beside her. Everyone who had been watching. I smoothed the front of my gown. I walked back through the doors into my wedding reception. The string quartet started playing again before I reached Marcus. He put his hand on the small of my back and bent down and said into my ear, "You okay?" I said yes. And I meant it completely. He kissed my temple and someone behind us began to applaud, one person, then two, then the kind of wave that moves through a room without being organized, and Marcus looked surprised and I did not, because I had known, standing at those oak doors, that the room had already decided. Not because I had asked it to. Because Vivienne had walked down that hall in that dress and the room had seen it and made up its own mind. My mother found me 40 minutes later near the cake table. She had moved through the room carefully, the way people do when they are trying to reach a destination without drawing attention to the fact that they have a destination. She stood beside me and did not speak immediately. She looked at the cake, for tears, white chocolate and raspberry, which was the only thing about the reception that had involved an argument between Marcus and me and which Marcus had won and which I was now glad about. Then she said, very quietly, "I didn't know she was going to do that." I looked at her. She was staring at the cake. "She mentioned she was having something made," my mother said. "Something elegant for the wedding." I thought she meant a new cocktail dress. I didn't ask. I should have asked. I waited. She finally turned and looked at me. Her face was doing something I had not seen it do before. Not the managed emotion she deployed in arguments. Something older than that, something that had been sitting behind all the managed emotion for a long time and had finally come to the surface. She looked, I realized, ashamed. Not of me. Of herself. Of the things she had allowed, or not bothered to prevent, or not looked hard enough at to see coming. "I didn't know," she said again. As if she needed me to understand the distinction. "I know you didn't plan it, Mom. But you also didn't ask." She pressed her lips together. The champagne glass turned in her hands. "I've never not asked about your life because I didn't care," she said. "I think I just always assumed you would be fine." I let that sentence sit between us for a moment. Then I said, "The difference between assuming someone is fine and checking that they're fine is the whole thing, Mom. That's the entire thing." She didn't answer. She looked at the cake again. Her chin moved once, a small involuntary shift, the kind that happens when someone is holding something in that is trying to come out. I looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had shaped so much of who I was, who had gotten so many things wrong without meaning to, and I thought about how much of her failure had been not cruelty but absence of attention, and how sometimes those two things produce exactly the same wound. "I'm going to go be with my husband," I said. "We'll talk. Not tonight, but we'll talk." She nodded. And then she said, "You look beautiful." Just the 3 words, no performance attached to them. Just the fact. I looked at her once more, and then I walked back to Marcus. Vivienne did not return to the reception that evening. She sent a text to my mother at 7:42 saying she had a headache and had gone home. My mother showed me the text later and I noticed she had not replied to it. I noticed my mother not replying to Vivienne's text, and I filed that away too, in the same place I keep the things about my parents that change the shape of a moment. My father found me during the first dance. He waited at the edge of the floor until the song ended and then he walked over and said, "Can I have the next one, if Marcus doesn't mind?" Marcus said he didn't mind. My father danced with me to a song neither of us knew the name of, and about halfway through he said, "I let a lot go by, Nadia. Things I should have said something about. I know that. I don't have a good reason for it. I just wanted you to know I see it now." I didn't say anything. I kept dancing with him. I think that was its own kind of answer. The national tabloid first contacted me 3 days after the wedding. I did not understand at first how the story had spread so quickly, and then I understood that 120 people had been in that room, and that several of them had been holding their phones, and that the era we live in does not keep secrets, it just chooses when to release them. A photograph had been posted on a private social account by one of Marcus's colleagues, a photograph that showed the lower hall through the open oak doors, Vivienne in her ivory gown facing Gerald and his team, and me visible at the threshold of the great room in my dress, hands at my sides, composed. The image was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The image was simply 2 women in 2 very different dresses in a very particular hallway, and anyone who looked at it knew exactly what they were looking at. Vivienne's lifestyle platform had 480,000 followers at the time the image began circulating. By the end of the week, her comments were disabled. 3 brand partnerships, 1 for a home goods company and 2 for a wellness supplement line, quietly ended their contracts. I know this not because Vivienne told me, but because 2 of the brands released statements about their brand values, which is the language companies use when they need to distance themselves from something without naming it directly. The reporter who contacted me was polite and brief. She asked if I would comment. I told her I had one thing to say and I said it simply. My wedding was a beautiful day and I am grateful to everyone who made it so. That was the only statement I made publicly, and I meant it, because it was true, and because the most devastating thing I could offer Vivienne in the aftermath was a story that was not about her at all. Marcus and I left for our honeymoon in Iceland 4 days after the wedding. On the night before we flew, we sat on the floor of our apartment eating takeout from boxes because we had been too busy to do a proper grocery shop, and Marcus said something that I have thought about many times since. He said, "You know what's interesting? You knew for 3 months. 3 months of knowing and you didn't say a word to her. You didn't post anything, you didn't give her any warning, you just quietly got ready." He paused and looked at me. "That's the most like yourself you've ever been." I thought about that for a long time, sitting on that floor with a box of noodles in my lap. He was right. I had not handled the situation the way the frightened 11-year-old who lost her certificate to a volleyball trophy would have handled it. I had not pleaded and appeased and swallowed my feelings and hoped for the best. I had simply seen the thing clearly for what it was, made a plan, and trusted myself to be ready. That is what 3 months of preparation looks like. That is what 31 years of being underestimated prepares you for, if you are paying attention. We flew to Reykjavik on a Wednesday morning and for 10 days I thought about almost nothing except Marcus and waterfalls and a small restaurant near our hotel that served the best lamb I have ever eaten in my life and that I have thought about on a monthly basis ever since. When we landed back at the airport and turned our phones off airplane mode, mine had 47 unread messages. Vivienne had sent 2. The first came 2 days after the wedding. The second came 5 days after. I read them both and I will tell you about them in a moment. But first I want to tell you what had been happening at home while I was watching the northern lights from a geothermal pool with my husband. The photograph that had been posted by Marcus's colleague had, by the time we landed, accumulated tens of thousands of shares across several platforms. The caption the colleague had written was short and factual. Sister of the bride showed up in an ivory gown designed to outshine the bride. Bride had already briefed security. The image told its own story, 2 women in a hallway, a security team positioned calmly between them, and the bride visible at the threshold in 340 seed pearls, composed and unshaken. People who saw it understood immediately what they were looking at. The comments did not require explanation. Priya had been sending me updates throughout the honeymoon in a series of voice messages that I listened to sitting on the edge of the hotel bed while Marcus ordered breakfast from room service. The tone of her messages across 10 days formed its own arc. Day 2 was incredulous. Day 4 was gleeful. Day 7 was careful. By day 9 she was telling me that Vivienne had posted, then deleted, then reposted, then deleted again a statement on her platform addressing the wedding. The statement, in its various versions, had contained the words misunderstanding, unfair, and my truth, which are 3 phrases that, when assembled together in a public apology, tell you immediately that no actual apology is forthcoming. Vivienne's 2 messages to me were consistent with this pattern. The first, sent 2 days after the wedding, read, "I just want you to know that what happened was not what you think it was. I would never intentionally hurt you. I hope we can talk when things calm down." The second, sent 5 days after, when the photograph had reached its widest circulation, was longer. It contained the observation that families should handle things privately rather than publicly, which struck me as a particular kind of audacity coming from a woman with 480,000 followers who had spent a decade curating every significant moment of her life for public consumption. It also contained the phrase "you know how much I love you," which I read twice, slowly, and then set my phone down on the bedside table and looked at the Icelandic ceiling for a while. I did not respond to either message before we landed home. I did not respond to them for 11 days after we returned. When I finally did, I wrote 3 sentences. I said that I heard her. I said that I was not interested in revisiting the events of the wedding by message. I said that if she wanted to have an honest conversation at some point, she knew how to reach me. I sent it on a Thursday evening and then I made dinner and did not check my phone again until the following morning. She did not reply for 6 days. When she did, the message said, "Okay." Just the one word. And I held that word in my mind for a moment and thought about how much had to have shifted in Vivienne, in whatever interior life she kept behind the performance, for that single syllable to be all she had left to offer. Then I put my phone in my bag and went to work. That was the end of Act 1 of whatever comes next between Vivienne and me. I don't know yet what Act 2 looks like. I'm not sure she does either. What I know is that for the first time in my life, the shape of that relationship is being decided by both of us, not just arranged around her comfort and my compliance. That is new. That is, I think, the only version of it I am willing to try. The first Sunday after we came home from Iceland, Marcus and I had my parents over for dinner. Not Vivienne. Just my parents. My mother arrived carrying a bottle of wine she had clearly put thought into, and my father carried a small plant in a terracotta pot that he set on the kitchen counter without explanation, the way men of his generation offer things they cannot quite say out loud. We ate pasta. We talked about Iceland, about Marcus's work, about the garden my mother had started at the back of their house. Nobody mentioned the wedding. Nobody mentioned the lower hall or the photograph or Vivienne's disabled comments. We just ate dinner together in my kitchen, the 4 of us, like a family that had recently learned to be a little more careful with each other. I am not going to tell you that everything was resolved that night. It wasn't. My mother and I still have conversations that end before they should, still navigate around the shape of certain subjects rather than through them. My father still defaults to peacekeeping when the temperature rises. These are old patterns and old patterns do not dissolve over a single dinner, however good the pasta is. What I will tell you is that something had shifted in the architecture of how we were with each other. A wall that had been invisible for so long I had stopped noticing it was there had developed, finally, a door. We were learning to use it. Vivienne and I spoke on the phone for the first time, a real conversation rather than a message, about 4 months after the wedding. She called on a Saturday morning and I picked up after the 3rd ring and there was a pause on her end, just a beat, like she hadn't fully expected me to answer. Then she said, "Hi." And I said, "Hi." And we talked for 41 minutes about things that were not the wedding. About her platform and the changes she was making to it. About a creative direction shift she had been considering for a long time and had been too afraid to pursue because it was less commercially obvious than what she had been doing. About a conversation she'd had with a therapist, which she mentioned quietly, without performance, as if she were still getting used to the fact of it. I listened. I did not offer advice she hadn't asked for. I did not bring up the dress. When we hung up I sat with the phone in my hand and thought about the sister who had shared a bedroom wall with me for 18 years and wondered which version of her had always been underneath the performance and how long it had taken both of us to find out. I want to be honest about what the wedding cost me, because Clara Weston stories are not about pretending the grief isn't real. It cost me the comfortable fiction that my family, complicated as it was fundamentally on my side. It cost me the story I had been telling myself for 31 years, that if I was just patient enough and quietly capable enough, the people who had been dismissing me would eventually see it. They were never going to see it on their own. I had to make them look. And making them look came with consequences I had not fully calculated, a season of cold silences, of relatives who did not know what to do with the version of events that didn't make me the difficult one, of holiday gatherings that were smaller and more careful than they used to be. That was real. I am not going to dress it up. What I gained was harder to name at first, and then it became the only word that mattered. I gained authorship. Of my own story, my own space, my own version of events. For 31 years, other people had been writing the narrative of who I was in this family, and I had been living inside their version of it, quiet and compliant and hoping my patience would eventually be recognized as the virtue I intended it to be. The wedding was the day I picked up the pen. Not to rewrite anyone else's story. Just to write my own. Marcus and I have been married for a year and 3 months now. Our apartment has more plants than when we started because Marcus turns out to have an inexplicable talent for keeping things alive, which is either a metaphor or simply a fact about houseplants, and I am genuinely unsure which. My mother texts me on Tuesday mornings now, just small things, a photo of her garden, a recipe she tried, a question about something she is reading. My father called me last month on a Wednesday for no particular reason and we talked for 20 minutes about a documentary he had watched. And at the end of the call he said, "Love you, kid," which he has never once said to me in a phone call in my adult life. I did not make a thing of it. I just set it back and let it be what it was. The Celeste Aurora dress is in a preservation box in the back of our wardrobe. 340 seed pearls, 4 months of work, the most beautiful thing I have ever worn. I do not need to get it out to remember what it felt like. I remember exactly what it felt like. I remember standing in those doors at the threshold of the great room with the oak doors open and the room behind me and the lower hall ahead of me, and I remember that I was not afraid. That is what I want to keep. Not the vindication, not the photograph, not the brand partnerships that ended or the comments that were disabled. Just that moment. The feeling of being completely prepared for the thing you have spent your whole quiet life getting ready for. If you are the person in your family who is always holding the door open while everyone else walks through it, I want you to hear this. The door can be yours. It does not require a confrontation. It does not require an audience. It just requires the decision, made privately, that you will stop building your life around someone else's comfort at the cost of your own. Make that decision. Then trust yourself to be ready when the moment comes. Because you will be. You already are. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.